Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today we have two excellent guests. The first is my co-professor at American University Law School for our export controls and sanctions class, and also a partner at Jacobson, Burton, and Kelly. Michael Burton, welcome to Embargoed.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'm glad to be here.
And we also have back for the 27th time, I think, Melissa Burgess, one of our regulars. It's great to have you back, Melissa.
Thanks, Tim. Not sure it's 27. We'll get there, though.
We're counting loosely. We're counting loosely.
Very loosely.
So today we're going to do something that we try to do once a year, and we try to do it in January. We're just a little bit late, but I still think we're doing pretty well. It's early February, February 6th, and we're going to do our year in review for 2025 for the Bureau of Industry and Security and Export Controls. And so we're going to mostly stick to the EAR today. There's really not a lot that happened in 2025 with respect to the ITAR, although maybe we'll talk about it in another year in review session that we're definitely going to do on CFIUS. But for today, we're going to talk about BIS, what BIS did in 2025, and we're going to do it in the same draft format that we walked through the OFAC year in review. So we're going to each go through and pick what we think was one of the biggest events with respect to BIS in 2025, and we're going to go through it in a draft. So Michael will go first, Melissa will go second, and I will go third. And we'll pick a topic, and we will talk about that topic, and then the next person will chime in with the topic that they think was important. So as the new guest star of the podcast, Michael, you're first up. What do you see as the biggest event of 2025 when it comes to BIS?
So in my typical contrarian fashion, for those of you who don't know me, I'm going to start with what BIS didn't do in 2025 as the biggest, and it'll I think be a nice segue into other things that we might want to talk about throughout the course of the podcast. But I guess number one is not issuing licenses as quickly as they have in the past, and I want to begin with a compliment to BIS in that I think they were really, had been for years, a standout agency in terms of efficiently processing license applications. And so now that for a variety of reasons, including staffing shortages and I think some administration policy reviews, and of course the government shutdown, their processing times have really seemed to fall off a cliff might be too harsh, but maybe not too harsh, that they've been a lot slower than they used to have been. And I think from, an outside practitioner's perspective, and when I see clients asking questions about BIS in 2025, a lot more of it has been oriented around how can I get my licenses issued on time or faster than they are, rather than actually substantive export compliance questions. So I think that's a bit of an issue. And I guess the other thing it sort of ties into it is, but not filling vacancies. And I know it's a slow process and there are a lot of issues going on with government hiring freezes of various types. But I think that it's been challenging for them to fill positions of people who may have retired in the past couple of years. And, again, to compliment BIS, they've had such a great, rank and file licensing staff and engineers and others who have been doing this for decades. And to lose that and have to replace it is a slow process. But I hope that in 2026, the powers that be enable them to make that a priority. And I guess the last thing I will say is, public outreach in 2025 by BIS has been a lot lower. We've experienced situations where they've declined to speak at various events that they normally speak at. I think there are rumors, if it's not flat out confirmed, that update is not going to happen in 2026. So I wish that they would do more public outreach, because they, to some degree, continue to publish regulations that are very complicated, especially for non-U.S. audiences, like various iterations of the foreign direct product rule. And I feel like if one's going to assert jurisdiction quite broadly, extraterritorially, it's incumbent upon them to educate the regulated community. And I don't feel like they've done a good job of that in 2025. So I hope that in 2026, that becomes, again, more of a priority. So with that, I will let you guys weigh in and see if you're similarly contrary or
So what do you think, Melissa?
defend BIS.
What do you think about the pick? I will just chime in quickly and say I think it's a great pick. And to your point, Michael, I think a lot of our client questions with respect to BIS are what's going on at BIS, and in many ways that's a compliment because I think of the agencies that we work with, historically BIS has been the most efficient, the most predictable. And so you could tell clients this is when a license will come in, and it generally would be right. You could get somebody on the phone or you could get somebody by email to actually answer questions pretty reliably and pretty quickly. And that just isn't happening in the same way. And and selfishly, I will say we generally do an update on Update Pod every year. I mean, did they think about that when they were trying to cancel Update? I just don't get it. Melissa, what do you think about the pick?
No, I think that's pretty accurate, and it'll be interesting to see how much it continues into the year. I think Michael's given BIS some New Year's resolutions if they didn't already have some. But it is true in comparison to certain other agencies, say OFAC. BIS was kind of reliable, and now it's been a bit less so. You do have that big churn, which obviously big loss, but perhaps really big opportunity. At some point, those decades of experience were going to disappear, retire, and at some point they were going to have to be replaced, have new people learn the ropes, step up. I think the hardest part is that a lot of it was happening all at once as opposed to kind of gradual turnover. But if what they've been doing behind the scenes has been as productive as it is published to be or advertised to be, 2026 could be much more efficient year, much more streamlined year. We'll see. There was a lot they didn't do last year in the regulatory, new rulemakings, massive rulemakings. We'll talk about some of what they did, but just in terms of massive volumes of paper, they weren't doing the same with the EAR that had been. It'll be interesting to see if that comes back. And it'll be interesting to see from the enforcement perspective, how much we start to see new themes as opposed to kind of last year. It looked like kind of moving some old things off the table as opposed to focusing on the new. So that kind of goes with the lower key last year.
Right. And I guess I should say again to not be too critical of BIS on the enforcement front. They've been, I think, proceeding at pace, and at least in my experience, voluntary self-disclosures have been processed, in similar timeframes, and they seem to be, they have a healthy set of enforcement actions they've undertaken. So I think it really is on the export administration side rather than the export enforcement side where things seem to have shifted. But I think you're right. 2026 might be different, and they have, it looks like from their website, more of the senior leadership in place. And so now that they have that direction, maybe they'll feel more empowered to start implementing policy, whatever that might be. And I guess I hope they do more, in that it seems like some of what they've started trying to do, coupled with the increased tensions between the United States and China, it's a really important time to handle this correctly. And I think BIS is kind of in the spotlight, which might be part of why they are having some difficulties implementing regulations and then sticking to those regulations once they've been implemented. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a bit, but some of the two big ones have been rescinded or suspended. So it's
right, which makes your point, right? what they didn't do this year. I mean, basically they're going backwards. But I think that one of the things that I've noticed is that it does seem like, with respect to the rulemaking and essentially administration of the EAR, that they're starting to get their footing again. I mean, when the AI diffusion rule was repealed, and then there was that hiccup with respect to the affiliates rule, both of which we may or may not talk about later on, you got the sense that there just wasn't anything happening in a forward way. But I think they're starting to get their footing. That, to Melissa's point, the new blood is coming in and starting to get a feel for this, and starting to implement and administer the EAR in a way that seemed to take a little bit of a pause following update March 2025.
Just going to say, now the pressure's on for them to execute. They had their kind of pause, their regroup period. So, the 2026 year in review may be a very different story.
That's right. We'll be talking about the lightning speed for licensing.
or yeah.
Let's hope that's right. The one last thing I was going to add about sort of what they didn't do, and I was trying to think of how to frame this as a didn't do versus did do, is not use normal notice and comment rulemaking in situations where they could, like the suspended affiliates rule. Everything seems to be interim final regulations, and they don't need to be, and you don't need to surprise industry with this stuff, right? I mean, the fact that it was suspended for a year doesn't suggest they needed to surprise all of these 50% owned affiliates in China and other places, that they were now going to be, by operation of law, part of the entity list. So do notice and comment rulemaking like you're supposed to. Don't rely on these shortcut measures.
There's a reason that those procedures have developed over the years. Sorry.
No, I think it's a good point, but I think that's been happening for a while. It's interesting to talk to other lawyers in separate regulatory areas, mention an IFR to them, and they say, "What is an IFR?" Because it's gotten to be very common, particularly with BIS. I feel over the last kind of the post export control reform era, where we had a lot of deliberation over what moves and what stays, and then kind of looking at more forward-looking controls, particularly semiconductors, other new technologies. I haven't run numbers, but I feel like we suddenly moved to IFRs became the norm as opposed to the exception. And you only get that kind of long drawn out process for really, really novel technologies, or more on the part of the other BIS house of ICTS. So it would be interesting if part of the change does revert to more ANPRM, NPRM, and all the rest. I think that's probably not going to happen for some areas, AI chips, but in other areas we may see it more as BIS struggles more with what is the best way to do this. We have a few years of experience of trying to do things certain ways, trying to get out ahead of problems. Not clear we succeeded, so maybe we do have more of that input, give and take, particularly when everything's moving so quickly, kind of from a political, foreign policy, national security perspective. Those regulatory wheels can turn in the background. Get some of that input to then inform the decisions. Is it actually feasible to, require tracking, require remote kill switches, to take some of these other measures?
Exactly. And I keep saying it's the last thing. And the one other thing, and I don't know that I can frame this as a negative, but I know it's a pet peeve of Tim's, is when you publish the regulations, why don't you make them effective the day you actually publish them? Yes, you can make them effective yesterday, but it's really not helpful when you spring things, unless it's something you want to surprise someone about, like, an entity list designation that you actually want to arrest transactions or something. But when you can, you don't have to make it retroactive to the Friday before the weekend that it's published. It's just not helpful, and
Yep.
frankly rude. So,
Yep.
Thank you for the shout out, Michael.
okay, you're
That
welcome.
is definitely a pet peeve
I
of
know you
mine.
feel similarly.
Yep.
All right, well, that's a great pick. Melissa, you're on the clock. What are you picking for one of the biggest events in the year in BIS?
Both the biggest event, but also the biggest non-event in some ways, that affiliates rule. In some ways, it's easy to say, oh, 2025 was kind of quiet on the entity list front. We weren't getting dozens of new listings regularly, but we had one event that had the potential to expand that entity list by untold numbers. And then we got a reprieve, which again, it's a reprieve. It isn't that was wiped off the books. Um, we may get some more reprieves in the future. We'll see. But I think if anyone was paying attention to that process and really thinking about their long-term compliance needs or expectations, to the extent they weren't thinking about affiliates of entity listed entities before, they should be. One, a lot of those third-party due diligence companies put in a lot of work to help do some of that mapping. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in terms of maybe you have knowledge now, or you should have known now in ways that before September you didn't have that knowledge. If you're a risk averse company, you're probably already thinking that way. If you're a more risk tolerant company, you're probably not thinking that way, and you're waiting till the last possible moment to have to figure that one out. Also on the assumption it could change again. But I do think, if you're in some of these hot areas where diversion's a risk, where there's political risk for you in terms of where your products are ending up, could be ending up if you're not doing that extra level of diligence, or if you're a company that's kind of already under enforcement scrutiny, you're probably going to be, or you should at least strongly consider looking at some of that additional information and figuring out to what extent you do or don't incorporate it into your screening, or at least you have the record of it, so when the switch is flipped again, you know which potential customers are cut off immediately.
All right. What do you think about the pick, Michael?
I think it's excellent. I think if I were not being contrarian, I would have picked that one. I think it's huge. Everybody for a month was running around, trying to quickly come into compliance with the rule as best they could before it was suspended. And I think it, bears reiterating, as Melissa did, that it's only suspended unless something else happens. It's going to pop back up on, I think, November 9th, 2026, thereabouts.
I think that's the right date.
And so, yeah, now is the time for companies to figure out how to come into compliance with the rule so that they're not surprised again. And I don't know what your experience has been with, interdiction software providers or other sort of third-party due diligence providers, but in terms of, you sort of alluded to this, Melissa, that they're putting time into try to figure out some of these ownership structures and make that part of what they're offering, which I think was something that was missing when the rule was first published and was making it very hard. But if they have spent the past months and the rest of the year building that database, it should make compliance much simpler than would have been the case.
And I guess looking at it from a slightly different angle, if you're one of the companies that a third party provider has wrongly, you believe, identified as being caught by that web, now's your time to try to work with them. Some may or may not work with you, but try to get that cleared up before it comes back, because this is your chance to kind of do that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, and I don't have any firsthand knowledge of this, but I think there is probably a decent likelihood that some of the targeted affiliates, or affiliates that would be entity listed by operation of law, if that's the term we should use, I'm not sure, but they're probably taking this year to restructure themselves so they're no longer going to be included.
Exactly.
which which is sort of frustrating. And,
Yeah.
that industry and the screening providers are going to spend all their time trying to get up to speed. And then will it be useful because they've essentially had this year to reorganize themselves? And in some cases, it won't be effective, or they can't because they're so close. But I think in some of these more marginal cases, and frankly, maybe in some of the more sensitive ones, they probably will, and sort of stay, one step ahead of where the regs are, unfortunately.
So, agree that it's an excellent pick. Probably you stole my pick, which
Sorry.
but I will say I don't think that they proceeded this way intentionally, but it actually, at least in my view, has mostly worked out better than it would have if they had just announced the rule in September and left it in place. They got the bang by announcing the rule, and they scared everyone out of their minds. And then they paused it. And, again, I'm not sure that this was the reason for the pause. I think the reason for the pause is that they're negotiating with China, and that this is this is a chip on the table. That's just my speculation, but that's my sense. But the effect of the pause has been that companies are now really on notice that this rule is coming, and they've got a year to prepare. So it's like advance notice of rulemaking, except it wasn't quite advanced. So from an industry perspective, I think it's a much better place. And yeah, companies can divest, but they could have always divested and gotten around to the rule. And here they've got notice that they better divest, or they're going to be right back where they were in November. The one thing that I will say that I hope is happening, but I've seen no indication that it is happening, the way the rule was written before, it was automatic for every company, and it went retroactively. And this is, I'm sure you guys have heard me say this before, because this is my big pet peeve with this rule, is that for however many years that the entity list has been in place, when BIS was thinking about putting a company on the entity list, what they weren't thinking about was, well, how would this affect all of their affiliates? Because the rule only applied to the company that they listed. So they weren't trying to consider that. And so that just wasn't part of the calculus when they listed. By contrast, OFAC, like my understanding from folks who are inside OFAC, is that that's probably the biggest consideration when they're trying to list a company is how is the 50% rule, when combined with this listing, going to affect the world economy? And with many of the smaller companies, there's no effect at all. But some of the bigger companies, this is a real deal, and they've thought that through. And sometimes they won't list because they're worried about how the affiliates rule or the 50% rule will work. And so, since BIS didn't need to do that and wasn't doing that, you've got 10 years of history where they just made designations without consideration of that, and then to just snap your fingers and say, well, now you're listed, and all these companies that we never thought about the listing of them, they're listed too, struck me as kind of, in some ways, very irresponsible. And maybe it'd be fine, like maybe the effect won't be that dramatic, but I suspect that it was going to be pretty dramatic in some instances. What I hope BIS is doing over the course of the next year is trying to figure out if there were these sorts of unintended consequences when you retroactively list, and when they come out with the rule in November, or when they reinstate the rule in November, they take some steps to mitigate some of those consequences. Because in the last rule, it was like, this is automatic, you can come to us and undo it, but the standard is going to be very high. And so I really hope that the year is being, I know it's being used by industry, and I think that's good, but I hope it's being used by BIS to mitigate some of these unintended consequences that I think were likely to arise.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I saw some circumstances during that month where it was having unintended consequences, like in the automotive sector, and things that really weren't intended to be targeted. I think that because of the integration of global supply chains and just the way the rule was operating, that it was creating some potentially very dire circumstances in Europe and places that it really wasn't intended to hit, in terms of how they handle supply chain, but the one that stood out was the automotive sector to me.
Well, and this was what was frustrating when, I mean, this was rumored to be coming for quite a while, at least within the export controls community. So it was coming. But the rationale that I always heard both before and after it came was, well, how bad could it be? Well, OFAC does it, right? This is OFAC's 50% rule. Why can't we do the same thing that OFAC does? And the answer is, prospectively, the answer is, yeah, great. I mean, that's OFAC's rule. But retroactively, the answer was, well, because OFAC is thinking about the automatic listing consequences when it lists in the first place, so that it takes that into account. BIS didn't take that into account. I mean, there was no reason for them to, and I think they would tell you they didn't, because they didn't have that rule. So yeah, you can adopt OFAC's rule, but you can't retroactively go back and adopt OFAC's analysis that OFAC used. I mean, that's why you can't adopt OFAC's rule retroactively, because you didn't do the same sort of thinking in the listing process. And I guess that's really, you never heard that batted around when people would say, well, yeah, why can't you just do what OFAC does? It does the 50% rule. And I thought there was an easy answer to it, but I didn't ever really hear that. It's like, well, yeah, it's just what OFAC does, so what's the big deal?
Yeah, theoretically, I mean, I actually think it makes a lot of sense, and like intellectually it makes sense, but as a practical matter, I think you're right. It's different in application, and also usually when OFAC is putting an entity on the SDN list, in many cases they're a fairly malign actor, or they've done something. They're not as well integrated into the global economy, and because so much of this, it's not that the entities in some cases have done something wrong or nefarious. Used to that was the case. Now they're in the higher tech sectors of China, and so they're sensitive, but they haven't done anything wrong, so they're not isolated from the international community in the same way as an embargoed country might be, or something like that. So I think it's operating a little bit more broadly by virtue of who the targets are as well, and what's being targeted from like a sectoral perspective.
It's a great point, Michael, because I think that was kind of what was seen as kind of the sweet spot of the entity list, right? If you put them on the SDN list, then you essentially cut them off completely, but you also cut off all of the 50% owned companies. So you cut off a big swath of companies completely. If we don't want to do that, or we don't want to, go after a sector, but we still want to hit them, you can use the entity list. It just stops, unlicensed exports of usually all items subject to the EAR, but just to that company. And so it's not the same sort of, it doesn't have the same sort of effect. It was kind of a punishment or a restrictive tool, but a lesser restrictive tool than the SDN list. If you start making it just like the SDN list, you kind of lose the benefit of that. And so like the fact is that I do think that because they did this in some instances where the effect would have been great, and I think China is the best example. OFAC doesn't do very many SDN designations in China comparatively. I mean, they do plenty, but China's big and the Chinese economy is huge, and so they could do a lot more. But my sense is that OFAC is very cautious in doing that, because the results of an SDN designation for a large Chinese company could be huge with respect to the global economy, and so it's very careful. It would rather kick it over to BIS to use the entity list. So the more that you make the entity list like the SDN list, the more havoc you create with every listing. And again, that might be what you want, but you should think about that at the time of the listing, and not just kind of do it and figure out what the consequences are later.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that makes good sense. And it's interesting that they've followed the OFAC 50% rule as much as they did. I mean, I guess it was a logical model, but I've always thought, it's better to be, how can I put this, deeper but narrower. And so why we've gone with 50% ownership when you could have control seemed odd to me. And like in my understanding of the EU sanctions, there is more of an owner controlled concept in terms of their designations. And so it's like we fired a shotgun instead of like an armor piercing bullet or something. And it's like, again, the restructuring and these other things that would allow companies to avoid it, but sweep in a lot of companies that probably aren't doing anything that's particularly nefarious or particularly sensitive. It just doesn't make a ton of sense to me or doesn't make perfect sense to me from a policy perspective. I don't want to give them ideas to add that. That's not, it wouldn't be helpful, but it's sort of a, just the whole thing. When you step back and start thinking about it, it's like, why is that the rule? And I thought it was weird, a little bit when, earlier before the interim final rule was in place. I thought BIS's policy was a bit odd that they really were only targeting like that location of the company. They were very like almost too specific, and it's like, well, why? I mean, like they're just going to move across the hall or something like that. Like, is that really how you want to administer this? So I don't know. I wish they're very good at writing super complicated rules in terms of like the FDP rules and things like that, but like step back and think about what you're trying to accomplish and how, and have logical and efficient rules instead of something other than that sometimes. So I guess that's my thought.
All right. Well, again,
But
great
a good
pick.
choice. You definitely
Yep.
good choice.
I think so far you're in the lead, Melissa, I think. All right. So it's my pick. And since I can't pick the affiliates rule and I can't pick the do nothing year for BIS, I am going to go for the changes in the export controls on Syria. Again, the lifting of the Syrian embargo is at least, as big a story when it comes to sanctions as it is to export controls, but it's a big story when it comes to export controls. And, I want to be careful here and say, in some sense, the Syrian embargo is lifted. Like, there's still a license requirement for everything, but there are a lot of new license exceptions that allow the selling of items that EAR 99 items that otherwise couldn't be sold to Syria. There are license exceptions that allow that in the tech sector, in aircraft and vessel parts, and other areas, and even a presumption of approval for a number of items, even when there is a licensing requirement. So there's still some significant restrictions on exports to Syria, but that is much different than it's been for the last 15 years or so. And so I think it's a big change, even though, at least in the short term, I'm not sure how big a export destination Syria is. I think that is the beginning of something that could easily change depending upon how Syria develops. So I think maybe we'll be looking back 10 years from now and think this was one of the biggest things that happened in 2025, and so that's why it's my pick. What do you think?
Melissa, you wanna go first this time?
No,
I mean, I think it's a good pick, but you go first.
Anytime comprehensive sanctions are lifted, it's huge. Whether there are immediate effects or the 10-year outlook, how that'll be, I think we'll see in 10 years. As a reminder, like China was subject to comprehensive sanctions at one point, and look at it now. Like most of us don't even remember that was the case. Yes, it's been decades. It probably will take Syria decades. I don't think it will be the next China. Watch me be wrong. There's a lot of reasons that just doesn't sound like it'll happen. But
I hear Damascus is very nice. If Syria were to, change, and it would be really good to be able to go to Damascus.
Yeah, but just the fact that there is that change in itself is fairly seismic. It may be like the least seismic of any of the comprehensively sanctioned countries. some of these others. I think it would be a much bigger deal, Cuba in particular, for that to change just from the history of it. But in and of itself, even if the effect is little, the smoke and fire of it is big.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was significant. I mean, it's significant just to remind people, as you did, Tim, that there are still Syria export controls. Because if you read the news and read the executive order and stuff, you go, "Oh, the sanctions have been lifted." Like, I'll blithely export things to Syria, and most things are still controlled there, even though there are a lot of license exceptions that are available. And the one for EAR 99 items is useful, but if a company's not used to operating under that, and um, my plug is always, don't forget about Part 746 to the EAR. Like, it exists for a reason, and BIS has sanctions, and I feel like sometimes companies, and depending on sectors, it's a little bit different. Certainly, financial institutions are very OFAC focused, and I think are much less aware of Part 746 of the EAR. But I feel like even some exporters are a little bit less aware of Part 746, and it's really important to make sure that you consult the OFAC regulations as well as Part 746 when you're dealing with a sanctioned country. And sanctions doesn't just mean a total embargo, right? So I think that's really important. I agree with what you all have said, that from a business perspective, it's probably not, there are not a lot of opportunities, maybe in the petroleum sector and some very limited areas. There are more opportunities. The other thing I guess I would say is, Syria is still one of the harder line boycotting countries, I think. So to the extent that companies start re-entering that market, I bet a lot of the standard terms and conditions that are being used still have boycott language from 1990 or something in their terms and conditions. So watch out, be careful, because there's this other part of BIS we haven't talked about as much, the Office of Anti-Boycott Compliance, who does aggressively enforce the anti-boycott rules. So, but no, I think Syria is a good addition to it, and it's great to see when sanctions programs are relaxed, and maybe we'll see others like Venezuela, in 2026 coming, at least having the sanctions scaled back to some degree or another. Who knows with Cuba? Maybe. I mean, we'll see.
We'll
We'll
see what
see.
happens.
Exactly.
I think one other point on Syria is it's gotten easier to export, but the compliance is a lot harder because before the answer was no, and now the answer is, well, let's figure it out. The anti-boycott piece, good call out, because that's such an easy one to forget. But EAR 99 is such a vast array of items. And almost any time, back to our entity list, almost any time you get a question that's not an obvious export or close to a controlled item question, you realize just how broad that array of the EAR 99 is. So there's a lot of things that previously couldn't or required a license that can go now, completely non-sensitive items. But again, for those companies that are thinking of doing it, it is a big compliance burden to think about it and to get it right, and to pay attention to other things like the lingering OFAC sanctions on certain parties and the many non-Syria specific sanctions programs you have to watch for. And as was, I think it was OFAC, probably BIS too, cautioned, watch for Russian diversion issues and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great final point, and one that I talk about with clients a lot, because I have a lot of clients in the food and pharma sectors, and they're allowed to do business in embargoed countries quite often, but it's complicated. And I always tell them, in many ways, Iran is a bigger challenge for you, or Russia is a bigger challenge for you, or whatever country we're talking about is a bigger challenge for you, because you can do business there, than it is for most companies where it's just, the answer is no, you can't do it. And OFAC won't give you a license if you ask. So look somewhere else. That's a much easier, simpler answer than the answer now is in Syria and in some of these other places where food and pharma can go, which is, yeah, you can do it, but boy, you better be careful because there's lots of rules and it's easy to trip up. So,
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. It's always easier to comply with a full countrywide embargo than with
Yep.
something that's
exactly.
like the Russia sanctions, where it's like I don't know what it's like an obstacle course. Maybe is a
Yeah.
good
Exactly.
Yeah.
analogy,
Yep.
um, and that keeps changing.
Yep.
All right, Michael, we've
Oh,
gone one cycle. You're up.
gosh,
You're on
now
the
it's getting
clock.
hard. I feel like I feel like we're starting quickly to scrape the bottom here. So I'm going to, and I sort of alluded to this before, but I will circle back to it a little bit and just say I think export enforcement is an important um, uh, area of emphasis for BIS in 2025 and moving into 2026. So just starting with kind of the moving into 2026 part of it. From what I read, it looks like that there's a budget request to for the Office of Export Enforcement to, I believe, and I could have the figure slightly off because I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's basically to double their budget and double the number of special agents, which is huge. Maybe it's a 50% budget increase, and I'm misremembering, but it's significant. So at a time when, in some areas, government's been shrunken, it looks like there is still under this administration a real coalescence around enforcement and imagine expanding the number of BIS agents or Office of Export Enforcement special agents 100% is huge. So it would go, I think, from like 100 to 200. So it's not, in absolute terms, it's still not a lot compared to like ICE or something like that. But it's for um, specialist investigatories and enforcement personnel, that's quite huge from my perspective. In terms of what the Office of Export Enforcement did in 2025, I agree with Tim's earlier point that they were really building on, I think, some of the past policies from the Biden administration. And when you look at the enforcement actions that were settled or otherwise resolved, there is, there's a significant lag time because of the facts of the case might have been, you know, 2 to 5 years prior. So we haven't really seen the Trump administration's new policies, to the extent they have new policies around enforcement, brought online, but just seeing how they're handling the cases um, during 2025 is consistent, but I think also it's reflective of toward the end of, um, let's say, Matt Axelrod's tenure at OEE. It is getting a little bit harder, I think, or harsher, a little bit more punitive. Again, most voluntary self-disclosures are closed without action. That's great. It's an important program for exporters with potential violations to take, to avail themselves of. But just looking at the penalty cases, I mean, a few things stood out to me. So there were, if I calculate correctly, there were 60 civil enforcement actions that resulted in a civil penalty in 2025. So it's a healthy amount. Most involve China, Russia, Iran, or entity list designees. So to the extent that you want to look at where the monetary penalties are being issued, it really is around those areas, perhaps not surprisingly. Um, and then the other part was, it seemed like there was a lot of attention on individuals. Like when I was going through and um, trying to analyze this and just reading through the FOIA reading room, I mean, a good chunk of the enforcement actions were against, and even non-criminal enforcement actions were against individuals. So that does seem to be a priority of OEE. Um, perhaps not surprisingly. I mean, other things that are probably starting to come online, although technically they're probably not 2025 policies. They're 2024 policies, but I know Tim and I love the um, it being considered an aggravating factor when one evaluates whether to make a voluntary self-disclosure and decides not to. So again, I'm not sure that these particular settlements reflect that, but I'm sure some VSDs and some enforcement actions that began in 2025 maybe do view that as an aggravating factor, and it'll be interesting to see if that's called out, in settlement agreements in 2026. So that's without getting into specific cases. I will let you guys tell me if that was a good pick or a mediocre pick.
I think it's good. It's a good pick. It's a good pick. Enforcement, I mean, just the fact that enforcement is expanding in the way that that you described is itself, a hugely important event. And I can tell you that we're seeing it in our cases. I mean, we're seeing a lot more enforcement on the, by OEE, by the special agents, a lot more calls, a lot more items stopped that are potentially going out of the country, and a lot more grand jury investigations. So and I would say a lot of what we're seeing is in the AI sector. We're probably not going to have time to get to it but we've talked about it on a bunch of other episodes. I mean, AI was a priority certainly of the last administration, and because of that, it's generally going to be an enforcement priority early in the next administration because that's what they were up to, and there is this lag. And so there's basically cases relating to AI and servers and potential diversion of servers overseas, and we're just seeing a ton of that type of work. So good pick, Melissa.
Yeah.
Yep. No, I agree. That's a really good one. I think a long-standing criticism of many agencies, not just BIS, but definitely BIS, is instead of creating new roles, enforce the ones you have. It's great to create new rules, but the people who are going to break them are probably going to break them regardless of how many there are, either willfully or not. Again, a lot of the AI is, well, some of it I'm sure is willful, but a lot of it is, there's this whole big world out there, and I see a way to carve a path in it for myself, and run first, stop and check with the lawyers later. I think it could be huge. I also am very curious to see whether we see any type of actual rollback in a regulatory way, or maybe just in practice, of some of the kind of harsher changes that Axelrod introduced in terms of, for instance, you have to admit in order to get that settlement, as opposed to kind of avoiding a full admission of whether or not you committed a violation. Some of the others, and I hope I'm not mixing up agencies, but basically the ability to put some of the settlement towards improving your compliance program. That's an industry-friendly measure. Yes, not maybe, they should have been paying for compliance, paying attention to compliance anyway, but having that as yes, we're punishing, but this is still a punishment because you're going to be spending a lot more on your compliance than you would have otherwise if you'd done it correctly. I think that'll be really interesting to see if we see that come back, continue, or maybe not, because again, maybe a lot of the enforcement is more of the fly-by-night type companies, that pop up and disappear, and so that doesn't make sense from an enforcement perspective.
No, those are really good points. I mean, it feels like, and again, I'm not sure that all this is cycled through in the settlement agreements in 2025 that I reviewed, but it does feel like there is more of a punitive, at least the articulation of the articulated policy is in a more punitive direction. And I fear that it's often hard to roll that back, or, politically, it's like, prison sentences and things that they just keep going up and up and up. It seems rare that they do scale them back to something that's more appropriate. And just sort of scrolling through some of the penalty actions that I had analyzed before, it doesn't look like BIS in 2025 was earmarking as much toward remedial compliance measures as opposed to just a fine. I could be, or a civil penalty. I could be wrong about that, but certainly compared to, let's say, DDTC, where there were only, I think, a handful. I actually don't think there were any consent agreements in 2025, but there were some in 2024, if I'm remembering accurately. And in like the last three, almost all of them, well, I think all of them had some amount that was earmarked, and often like half the penalty was earmarked for compliance upgrades. One thing I would note, just in terms of penalty levels, like if you all are familiar, or if the listeners are familiar with the cadence design systems, so that was, I think, the largest civil penalty that BIS issued in 2025. So it was 95 million plus a concurrent $45 million DOJ civil forfeiture. So it's a lot. And I mean, Seagate still is, I think the largest at 300 million on the BIS side, but the penalty levels can be very high. And, we're starting to approach like what we've seen with OFAC. And so it is important that, all indications are that there's going to be more enforcement rather than less, and it's probably skewed in a harsher direction. I mean, one of the other more subtle, I don't want to say sneaky, but it feels sneaky, things that I believe was done at the end of the last administration was rejiggering the matrix that BIS uses, that's sort of analogous to what OFAC uses in terms of how they create their base penalty amounts and that sort of thing. And they rejiggered it in a way that actually gives them more latitude to impose higher penalties. Not that they needed to do that. I guess they felt like they did, but I think there was plenty of grist for the mill when they want to impose high penalties. They don't seem to have a problem with it. And I guess the last thing I would say on this point that one of you raised is, when to the extent that there is more enforcement and there are these complicated regulations, it's sort of the point I was making earlier, that it really is incumbent upon BIS to help industry comply, and particularly non-US parties who may not be as familiar with the rules and may be the ones who are really bearing the brunt of doing the de minimis calculations and the foreign direct product rule calculations. And it just feels easy after the fact to say you did this wrong, but I would say to OEE and others, like, try to comply with it. Try to comply with it.
Right.
If you're a non-English speaker and you're not a lawyer, and put yourself in those people's shoes and figure out, okay, what do we need to do to make this intelligible to the regulated industry, which is not just a hyper-specialized US audience.
I think we ought to benchmark compliance with the foreign direct product rule by testing BIS agents, giving them kind of a foreign direct product rule calculation test, and whatever percentage they get right is basically the same percentage that any company gets right. And if the company gets right the foreign direct product rule issues right more than the benchmark for the BIS agents, that's compliance. That's what I think.
I think that's an awesome idea.
Yeah.
I would go so far, and I think you will sympathize with this, Tim. We should give a criminal procedure exam to most law enforcement officers and see how they rank on those.
And we mean this with the greatest respect.
Of course, we do. Of course,
they have very hard jobs, but
truly, like, I think that the special agents at OEE and the leadership at OEE are true professionals, it's just really hard. That's the point, is that it is hard even if you're an expert. And, like, I've been practicing in this area for nearly 30 years now, and I have to reread things. I have to consult with other people. I get confused. I'm like, is that what they really mean? And so if you're a special agent who's working multiple cases and has had training but isn't reading the rules all the time and thinking about it from different angles, it's very challenging. And I guess that's the point, is, does it need to be so complicated? Or is there a way to, make them meaningful and effective and efficient, but also comprehensible and something that reasonably can be expected for the regulated community to comply with?
And just the corollary to that is, if it needs to be so complicated, you need a system where essentially you acknowledge that lots of mistakes will be made, and most of them will be inadvertent. And so when we see inadvertent mistakes, we're going to treat them like a necessary consequence of the complexity, and not as kind of the federal case of the year that you're going to go make your beans on because somebody screwed up a calculation of the foreign direct product rule, because it's just inevitable. It's just too hard. And that was, I think, for a long time, kind of the guiding principle of BIS enforcement was, look, we get the companies are, as long as you're trying and you're meaningfully trying, and when you mess up, you come talk to us about your mistake, or at least you do it in circumstances where you think we'd want to know about your mistake. Your risk of a meaningful penalty, or even any penalty, is really low. You're probably not going to get penalized for any of this stuff because you're trying. We're going to reserve the penalties for the companies that just aren't trying at all. And what I worry about with some of the changes particularly in the Biden administration, is that the message went out, well, we don't care if you're trying. If you screw up, you're going to get a lot of trouble. And if you screw up and you don't tell us, you're going to get in even more trouble. And that's just a really tough environment when the rules are so complex.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I totally agree with you. And I think that it's, what we don't see, again, in fairness to OE, is we don't see the statistics for all of the VSDs that were closed without action, or closed with a warning letter in 2025. I'm sure it's a lot, and maybe OE will publish the statistics often at update. Those statistics are published, and I imagine that 60 settled cases is probably a small percentage relative to the VSDs that were closed without action. And what I think I'm inferring from the analysis that I performed, not to make more of it than it was, but just sort of reading the actions and looking at the trends, is if you make a VSD and there aren't what I would call egregious factors, if we want to use the OFAC terms for them, egregious factors, you probably are in a there's a high likelihood that you won't receive a monetary penalty. However, that seems to be shifting if it relates to entity list designees, China, Iran, or Russia. And so I'm sure there are VSDs where monetary penalties weren't imposed involving those, but a number of the settled enforcement actions in 2025 that related to those types of targeted countries and entities were the result of VSDs, and they still got pretty significant penalties. So I think that's maybe the takeaway is, hey, VSDs are great. They're important. You can certainly mitigate your risk, but don't expect not to face a monetary penalty if you've dealt with China, or if your violations relate to China, Iran, Russia, or the entity list.
All right, we're an hour in, so I think that's going to be the last word, but I will throw it out there for you, Michael, and you, Melissa, to give some parting thoughts to 2025. To say goodbye to 2025. You've got 30 seconds.
Hoping for a more productive 2026. Good riddance to 2025. Let's move forward and have a productive year in export compliance.
Sounds good. I won't miss the lack of multiple 100-page NPRMs. It would be really nice if we have some quietness again on that front, and that if there is anything major like that, it's to simplify, not to add complexity. One can
I
dream.
agree.
One can dream.
Yeah. I'm not going to hold my breath, but yes, why one has to make 100+ page regs for these things is somewhat interesting, but we can save that for another discussion.
Yep.
2026 will be the year of calm simplicity and ohm, I think.
The age of Aquarius or something, right? You're entering the age of
Exactly.
Aquarius.
Exactly. And with that, thanks for coming on, Michael. Great to have you.
Thank you very much. I
Hope you
appreciate
can
it,
come
and
back.
I really enjoyed the experience, and I hope it was valuable insight for our listeners.
And Melissa, thank you again.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
And for the listeners, stay export compliant, and we'll see you next time.
Produced by Heartcast Media.